Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. Would ask everyone here in-house to make that last courtesy check that your cell phones and other noise-making little devices have been turned off. It's always appreciated. And of course, we will post the program on the Heritage homepage for your future reference, and our internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply addressing them via email to speaker@heritage.org. And Hans, I believe you are going to discuss this nice new little booklet from Heritage. Is that correct?
I can, or you could mention it.
No, I'm going to let you do it. Since you know more about it than I do, I hope. Hosting our program today is Hans von Spakovsky. He is our Senior Legal Fellow in the Edwin Meese III Center for Legal and Judicial Studies. He is an authority on a wide range of issues, including civil rights, civil justice, the First Amendment, immigration, and the rule of law. He is also manager of our Election Law Reform Initiative, where he studies campaign finance restrictions, voter fraud, voter ID, enforcement of federal voting rights laws, and the administration of elections. He has been a member of the Federal Election Commission, served as counsel for the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Justice, as well as serving on State and County Board of Elections. Please join me in welcoming Hans von Spakovsky. Hans?
All right, well, welcome to Heritage. Glad to have everyone here. As you know, we're less than 3 weeks away from the midterm congressional elections that may determine control of the U.S. Senate, as well as state elections in which there are many local and state offices up in contention, including governorships. We've had a series of decisions from federal courts, including the U.S. Supreme Court, in just the past couple of weeks, all about the rules that are going to govern the elections in November in Ohio, North Carolina, and Wisconsin. And the issues there have included everything from voter ID to same-day registration and early voting. We just have had news reports of voter fraud, something that the editorial pages of the Washington Post, the New York Times, and Attorney General Eric Holder says does not exist, which includes a former police chief in Pennsylvania who was just convicted of absentee ballot fraud to benefit his wife and her running mate in a Democratic primary for town council, and the fraud apparently flipped the election for the running mate. Or a former state legislator in Connecticut who was just arrested and charged with 19 felony charges, including voter fraud. The U.S., unfortunately, has a long history of voter fraud. This is something the Supreme Court mentioned itself just a couple of years ago in a case out of Indiana. And what the court said about that was that it could be particularly bad in close elections. That's where it could make a difference. Now, every American citizen should be eligible to vote. They should be able to vote, but we also should make sure that when they do vote, their votes are not diluted or stolen by other fraudulent voting. Election integrity is fundamental to free and fair elections, and it's free and fair elections that give us the ability to choose our leaders at the local, state, and national level, and that is fundamental to maintaining our democracy. So the question is, 3 weeks away from the election, is your vote in the upcoming election going to be safe? What's the status of our registration and election process? How accurate are our registration rolls? How accurate is the counting of the votes? And what problems can we expect? We've got 3 experts here to talk about it, including 2 secretaries of state and a citizen advocate, someone who's been very active in trying to make sure that we have fair and secure elections. I'm going to introduce all 3 of them, if I may, and then we'll just go right down the line so they can speak. We're going to start with Chris Kobach, who's sitting there at the end. He's the 31st Secretary of State for Kansas. He began his term by introducing the Secure and Fair Election Act in Kansas, which did a number of things, including putting in a voter ID and requiring proof of citizenship when you register to vote. It was adopted by both houses of the state legislature, including a majority of the members of both political parties who voted to approve this piece of legislation, and it was signed by the governor into law. Now, prior to his election, he was a professor of constitutional law at the University of Missouri in Kansas City, and he was a nationally recognized litigator who's represented U.S. citizens, cities, and states in cases involving immigration across the country. I actually served with Chris, although he was a bit higher than me at the Justice Department. During the Bush administration, he had a White House fellowship to serve in the office of the Attorney General under John Ashcroft and became the Attorney General's chief advisor on immigration issues. Next to him, we were going to have Scott Gessler. He is the 37th Secretary of State of the state of Colorado, and he was sworn into office at the beginning of 2011. Scott was a successful small businessman, election law attorney. He was a partner at a law firm where he focused on election law, constitutional law, public policy litigation, campaign finance, and commercial litigation. He also served at the U.S. Department of Justice, where he focused on international criminal law and terrorism, and served as an Army reservist. He has also done quite a bit in Colorado, particularly working on cleaning up the voter rolls there and trying to get access to federal government databases that would help the state do that, and I think he's going to talk a little bit about that. Finally, but not least, is Catherine Engelbrecht, who's the founder and president of True the Vote, a citizen organization that started in Texas dedicated to improving election integrity. Prior to 2008, Catherine did not have much involvement in politics. She and her husband run a very successful business that supplies equipment for the oil field industry, but she frankly got concerned about what our government is doing and the decisions being made by politicians, and so she decided to get involved. And I have to tell you, we thank you for doing that, Catherine. True the Vote educates voters, it researches the veracity of voter registries, trains and mobilizes volunteers to work in polling places, and advocates for comprehensive election code reform legislation. True the Vote quickly expanded beyond Texas, and I think it now has relations with or organizations in something like 30 states. And unfortunately, simply because she wanted to be sure that our election process is fair, she almost immediately became the target not only of extensive litigation filed against her by certain progressive groups, but she, her husband, and their business, which I don't think had ever had a visit from the federal government, suddenly had visits from everyone from the FBI to the ATF to problems with the IRS, which goes to show that in a country where we think we are secure in our political beliefs, apparently that does not sometimes stop you from being harassed by the government. So now we're going to start with Chris Kobach.
Hans, do you want me to speak up there or here?
You can do either one.
I'll stand up. Well, thanks for coming to this event, and thanks to the Heritage Foundation for putting it on. As Hans mentioned, the state of Kansas has the Secure and Fair Elections Act, which I helped to draft and push through our legislature in 2011, shortly after I was elected. And really ran on that platform, saying that in Kansas we had the opportunity to show a model to the country of what arguably is the most aggressive set of statutes in preventing voter fraud, and I think we've done that successfully. As Hans mentioned, the statute does require photo ID at the polls. It does require proof of citizenship for all newly registered voters. And then the third element is it also has equivalent security for mail-in ballots. And this is very important because many of our photo ID states do not, and it just drives the voter fraud into the mail-in form. What we require is that when you request your absentee ballot, which is our word for the mail-in ballot, or advance ballot, you have to sign your name, and the name has to be verified with the signature we have on file. So the signatures have to correspond before you will be given your absentee ballot. In addition, you have to provide either a photocopy of a photo ID with your request form, or you have to write your full Kansas driver's license number if you have one. And so that is the equivalent of having the person with the driver's license in hand, and that gives us we believe equivalent security for the mail-in ballots too. I just want to update you all. I assume many of you already have an interest and knowledge in this area. Update you on 3 things that are happening with relevance to Kansas: the EAC lawsuit, the GAO report of last week, and the Interstate Cross-Check Program, also known as the Kansas Project, which I've given you some handouts on. Number one, the EAC lawsuit. This is a lawsuit that's currently pending in the 10th Circuit. I argued the case in front of the 3-judge panel on August 25th. It stems from a lawsuit the title of the case is Kobach and Bennett versus Election Assistance Commission. Bennett is Ken Bennett, the Secretary of State of Arizona. Essentially, the 2 states sued the Election Assistance Commission because we are 2 of the 4 states that have proof of citizenship in our laws. The other 2 states, by the way, are Alabama and Georgia. However, there are basically 2 ways, well, there are 3 ways you register to vote. You register at the DMV, or you use your state form, or you use the federal form. The federal form is a 25-page form that includes a separate set of instructions for every state. Well, when we changed our law to require proof of citizenship, we made a request to the Election Assistance Commission, which is supposed to be an agency that has the ministerial duty of updating the form to reflect state law. We said, hey, our law changed. We need a line on the Kansas instruction saying you'll need to provide proof of citizenship. And the EAC refused. And then the lawsuit, which essentially delivered the decision-making of the EAC into the Justice Department, not surprisingly, continued to refuse. And we filed suit in August of last year, asking essentially this agency to change the federal form to reflect our state laws. Because right now there's a big loophole in our proof of citizenship law. If you use the federal form, if you're willing to go online and look for it and get it and print it out, then you don't have to prove citizenship using the federal form. Well, we took the case to federal district court first in Kansas, and on March 19th of this year, the federal district court ruled in our favor and issued an order enjoining the EAC, ordering them to change the federal form to reflect Kansas and Arizona's proof of citizenship requirement. But they sought a stay of that decision, and they got it from the 10th Circuit pending appeal. And so we are waiting with bated breath for the decision from the 10th Circuit. The court didn't promise, but indicated that it would try to have a decision down before Election Day. Until that point, we are treating federal form registrants who do not provide citizenship in sort of a separate category, because under federal law, the NVRA, the National Voter Registration Act of 1993, only applies to federal elections. It only purports to apply to federal elections, not to state elections. And so we're saying, look, if you don't want to provide your proof of citizenship and you use that federal form, we will allow you to vote in the federal elections, but you won't be eligible to vote in all the state elections further down the ballot. Now, we are hoping that that discrepancy will be erased as soon as we hopefully win in the court case, but that's the status of the case. So keep an eye on the newspapers, because we may have a decision any day now. Second development is the GAO report. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. It came out last week, and this was the long-awaited report from the GAO on the effect of photo ID on participation. And the GAO selected 2 states, Kansas and Tennessee, both states with photo ID laws, as their sort of test states. And they compared these to other states and came out with a conclusion that, lo and behold, photo ID does reduce voter turnout by an amount, depending on the state, around 2% is what they estimated. The results of that survey of that study, I believe, are completely flawed. And there is a letter from the state of Kansas and a letter from the state of Tennessee explaining all of the flaws in the study. But let me just give you a few of them. One is that the GAO, we have this image of the GAO. I long had this image when I was working in the executive branch. That the GAO, they're this nonpartisan group of experts. They're so good, and everything they touch is golden. Well, the GAO didn't even bother to do its own research. They actually contracted out the number crunching to an organization known as Catalyst. If you've heard of Catalyst, it's a Soros-funded organization created by Harold Ickes, the former Clinton aide, to help the left-wing groups get out the vote. According to its own mission statements, its mission is providing, quote, progressive organizations with the data and services needed to better identify the people they need to persuade and mobilize, end quote. That's the organization that did the number crunching. And apparently the numbers they used were a bit dated, and their past use of numbers has been highly suspect. I say apparently a bit dated because the Tennessee Secretary of State's office had no record of them getting a recent copy of a recent file of the voter registration rules in the state of Tennessee. That's one problem with it, but the other, and there are many problems if you read the state response letters, but the other problem I'll tell you is specifically with respect to Kansas. The study essentially compared apples to oranges. What they did is they looked at our two states, and then they took a bunch of other states that did not have photo ID laws, and they said, well, look, voter participation dropped this much from 2008 to 2012 in Kansas, but it dropped only this much from 2008 to 2012 in Maine, Maine being one of the comparison states. Therefore, photo ID must be the factor. We've isolated for everything else. Well, they didn't. They didn't isolate for the number one factor that drives voter turnout. And what would that be? A competitive election. Yes. That's why people go to the polls, because there's someone they're interested in voting for or voting against, and there's something that drives them, motivates them to the ballot. Well, Kansas, in 2012, every state, every 12 years, will have a cycle where there is no Senate candidate on the ballot, no U.S. Senate candidate. And so Kansas, we have our statewide elections this year, and they're offset from the presidential elections. So if you're looking at a president, so what you need to do is compare apples to apples, a year in which there is no Senate candidate like 2012, because there's no get out the vote in Kansas unless there's a statewide campaign. Smaller campaigns just don't do massive get out the votes in our state, and that's true in most states. Kansas is not a competitive presidential state, so you don't have the presidential campaigns doing get out the vote. As a result, if you compare apples to apples, you would compare Kansas in 2012 with Kansas in 2000. And lo and behold, if you make that comparison, you find that the voter turnout was nearly identical. It was 66.7% in 2000 and 66.8% in 2012. Exactly what you'd expect if you're comparing apples to apples. Instead, they compare Kansas to Maine, which had on the ballot a same-sex marriage issue in 2012, which obviously drives people to the polls. Also had a competitive Senate race in 2012. And so you're making completely irrelevant comparisons, and that's the kind of sloppy research that the GAO report was based on. Let me give you a few more stats from our 2012 election, which was the first major election with our photo ID law in place. 1.2 million people voted. A total of 838 showed up without photo ID at the polls. That's 0.07%, or fewer than 1 in 1,000 people. The law allows you to bring your ID in the week after the election if you so choose. 306 of those 838 chose to do so. The others, obviously, you wouldn't choose to do so if the election you're interested in was won by 10,000 vote margin. Lots of people are going to say, well, I'm not going to bother. And 532 chose not to do so. But we checked, and the vast majority of those 532 had a driver's license already in the Kansas driver's license files. And then, of course, there are many other photo IDs that are available to use as well. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about the third item, and that is the Interstate Crosscheck Program. For those of you who aren't aware of what this is a program that the state of Kansas started. It actually began in 2007 with 4 states in the Midwest, Kansas, Nebraska, Missouri, and Iowa. And the idea was, hey, let's compare our voter rolls once a year, and let's see if we have people who've moved from one state to the other, and that will help us keep our voter rolls clean. Because our system, with the NVRA in particular, motor voter, it's very easy to get on the voter rolls, but there's very little at the back end to keep our voter rolls clean when people move from one state to the other in this highly mobile society. And so this project was an attempt to do that and basically look at the states, and if a person is registered in more than one state, then the state that has the older registration record can send the voter a mailing, a postcard saying, hey, looks like you left our state. Would you like us to take you off the voter rolls in our state? If and only if the person says yes, then the person is taken off the voter rolls, or if 2 federal election cycles pass and the person still hasn't responded, then they can be taken off the voter rolls. And this is consistent with how the NVRA says we are to do it. Anyway, the program has grown mainly because I've been pushing it. I think this is a really important initiative, and we now have there were 13 states participating when I became Secretary of State, and I've been twisting the arms of my fellow secretaries, trying to badger them to join the program, because the bigger the program gets, the better it is. And so I have here the 2014 data. These are all the states that are in the program. There are 28 states, as I mentioned, right now. And the data is in this chart, which is got pretty small numbers. Apologize for that, but that's the only way we could get it all together on one piece of paper. There are over 100 million records. In other words, 100 million voter registration records in the 28 participating states. And if you look where the two states, the two rows meet, those are the number of voters that are the probable matches of people who are registered in both states. So if you look at Kansas and Colorado, our two states, speaking of Scott here, we have about 11,354 matches, people who are likely registered in both states. That means those people have the exact first name and last name and date of birth. Now, I say likely matches. Some of them will turn out to be false positives, because you'd be amazed how many people have your exact last and first name and date of birth. There are probably several of you out there speaking in terms of your records. So additional checking has to be done by the states. Now, in many of these records, there's also a Social Security number. In most states have roughly half of their registered voters we have a last four social. When you have that as well, then you can be almost certain that you have an actual duplicate. We do this once a year. We send the information back out to the states, and then the states can begin the process of contacting the voters, and then cleaning up the voter rolls if it turns out that indeed it is a match, and they have two people registered in the same state. And indeed, the vast majority of these are legitimate matches. The other thing the cross-check program does, and this I believe is even in some ways more valuable, well, they're equally valuable, is that it tells you when someone has voted in both states. We also compare the voting history. So if you have a person who's registered in both states and it indicates that the person has voted in both states, then you have a person who has probably committed both a federal crime and a state crime. And it's pretty easy to follow up on this. You contact the county in both states where the vote allegedly occurred. You look at the signature of the person. And most states require a signature on the poll book or a signature on the advanced ballot request form. And if you have a signature match, then you've got a slam dunk prosecution. You've got a paper record signed by the voter in both states indicating that he or she voted in both states. So, and the numbers are pretty significant. Many of you may have heard North Carolina recently joined the program. And not only, you can see here, North Carolina had a lot of matches. They had a total of almost 600,000 voting record matches. That is to say, people registered in the state, likely matches again. Some of them will prove to be false positives. But they, almost 600,000 people registered in North Carolina, another state, but they also had several hundred likely double votes, which is pretty amazing when you consider that we have lots of close elections. And if you have just a handful of illegitimate votes by somebody who's actually residing in another state, then you've got a real problem, because you potentially can have illegal votes swinging the outcome of the election. So I'm going to continue to push this project. Not surprisingly, some people on the far left, there are many Democrat states involved in the program, so I'm not going to say just the left, but on the far left, they criticize this. They don't want to see anything that cleans up our voter rolls. But this, I think, is a reasonable effort of states cooperating without the federal government telling us to. This is a state initiative done at the state level. Oh, and by the way, we don't charge the participating states a dime. Done efficiently, and it shows that states can cooperate and get things done in many cases where the federal government merely gets in the way. So anyway, thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to take questions after we're all done.
Thank you. My name is Scott Gessler. I'm the Secretary of State in Colorado, and I applaud Secretary Kobach for getting the Secure and Fair Elections Act. In Colorado, we have essentially the antithesis of the Secure and Fair Elections Act. In 2013, the legislature passed mandatory mail ballots, so everyone in the state receives a mail ballot, as well as same-day voter registration, and on a strictly partisan vote with no bipartisan input in the legislature or from me. So we've gone in a different direction in Colorado, and what I'll do is I'll talk a little bit about sort of how I approach this subject when you have a legislative framework that is not as friendly towards election integrity as I'd like. And just to start off with a little sort of historical framework, I mean, if you look at sort of the early days of the Republic, one of the first reforms we had at the beginning of the 1800s was states beginning to keep lists of voters. registration lists. And I think that's in part because you had slowly a more mobile population. And one of the big reforms, of course, was the Australian ballot, which really came into being in the late 1800s, around the turn of the century in the United States. And the Australian ballot sort of had four big reforms at that point. One is you had a government that printed the ballot that contained all the names of the candidates, that was distributed at a polling place, and people voted in secret. Because prior to that, a lot of times people did not vote in secret. You were expected to man up, and it was all mail elections mostly at that time. You were expected to man up and tell people how you voted, and there'd be drunken brawls at polling places and whatnot. So those were the big reforms. And I think what you've seen sometimes is the eroding of some of those reforms, in part because technology allows that to happen. And I think you're going to see a lot of turmoil, or change is another way of saying that, over the next decade with technology, where I think it's going to open the door, already has, for voter fraud in some instances, but it may find a way also to limit that and resolve those issues as well. So technology can be used for good or for evil. We hope on the election integrity side it'll be more of a force for good. So let me just tell you some of the topics that are going on in Colorado and the approach from sort of a government official standpoint on how to resolve or deal with those from an elections integrity standpoint. So Colorado passed a legislative change where we have, among other things, all mail ballots. Colorado is sort of the everything state. We want everything. We have early voting, we have mail ballots, we have still, even now, in-person voting, all kinds of different ways to register. It's a very complex system. So now we have all mail ballot system. So Colorado, like many western states, had about 70% people who voted by mail in elections. We have a no excuses absentee. That's in part because we have long ballots due to the ballot issues, so people want to study them. It's also in part because local election officials spent a lot of time and effort, and frankly government money, encouraging people to vote by mail, because administratively it makes it easier during election day. So despite all those admonishments, we had about 30% of the people who did not want to vote by mail. But we have that now. So if you are registered in Colorado, you will get a mail ballot. And this has a couple problems. One is, when vote fraud occurs, oftentimes mail ballots are the vehicle of choice. We do have signature verification in the state of Colorado. The ballot comes in and the signature has to be verified against another signature on file. Unfortunately, that's not a science. It's sometimes an art. And we've seen instances, most counties, 63 out of our 64 counties, have bipartisan teams that do that, which is good. One county, Boulder County, I have no problem calling them out, refused to do that in the last major election. But one of the things I found interesting is when you had those individuals doing it, we saw huge variances in the signature acceptance rate. Some, there was a lot of rejects, some there were very few rejects on the signature verification. And it shows you that the standards are very, very difficult when it comes to that. The other problem is you lose secrecy. Remember the Australian ballot, one of the things was secrecy. And we've had problems in a southern central Colorado county. In fact, I just had someone call me about running a local election, wanting a polling place, because they have real problems with intimidation. It's a relatively rural, it's a very rural district. Everyone knows one another. It's a knife fight in a phone booth, those elections are, and they're worried about voter intimidation. The other problem is the databases are sloppy. Our databases, I think every state database has some slop in it. And for example, we had a woman running for the state legislature, and in the primary where she was running, she was unopposed in the primary, but she received 2 ballots in the mail. One had her maiden name. She had gotten married and changed it. She thought she changed it. In fact, it was treated as a new registration. So she got 2 ballots in the mail. Now, she could have easily voted those 2 ballots. The signatures would have matched. It wouldn't have been a problem. And no one would have ever known any different. So you have variants of names. You may have a first initial, middle name, first name, middle initial, and they're treated as separate voters in a database, and those go out. And then finally, you have point of failure with the post office. I have news for everyone in this room. Post office service is becoming more expensive, and their service is they're providing less service because of budget problems. And I think, frankly, when it comes to disenfranchisement, the greatest vehicle for disenfranchisement in the country is the post office, where ballots come in late. We have that problem in Colorado. They've reduced service centers. In rural areas, if you send a ballot across the street, if you send a piece of mail across the street, it actually goes a couple hundred miles to Denver, gets processed there, and goes a couple hundred miles back. So we've had real problems with that. Same-day voter registration. The challenge we had there are no protections with respect to provisional ballots. People can show up, vote on the same day, their ballot is counted immediately. We have had problems where people show up, they vote, the clerk and recorder will send out a confirmation card immediately after, and it gets bounced back with no person living at that address or no such address. So we have had issues. That's a likely case of voter fraud. You can't prove it, and you don't really know who to go after because the name apparently just exists and that person is no longer there. We don't have photo identification. We do have identification, but it's a weak identification, a utility bill. In fact, during some of the testimony, people showed how they could take utility bills and with a quick Photoshop easily forge a name on them, print it out, and there you had it. Our databases are not where they need to be. And I think with technology, this is a real opportunity to improve. Secretary Kobach and I spoke about the cross-check last night over a beer. It's not where it needs to be. We're not using it well enough. I won't sort of cast aspersions on that. But there's the ERIC program out there. That's not where it needs to be in my view. There's lots of false positives. There's a lot of problems with variants of names, things along those lines. So for example, with the ERIC, my state, Colorado, is one of the few that participates in both interstate. We're obligated, among other things, to send out invitations, postcards, for people who have moved into our state, very likely, and we use the strictest matching criteria available in ERIC. So we sent them out. One of the cards we sent out was to a person who was the partner of a state legislator, state senator, senior state senator. And the senator was furious about that because his partner had passed away 2 years prior from cancer. It was tragic. I personally knew about that death, and yet we still sent a ballot, an invitation to register to vote to that person. Now, the state senator thought I did it purposefully, which wasn't the case. It was an error, but it shows you the problems that exist in some of these databases. Residency. So, in Colorado, as in most states, you have a few requirements. Citizenship is one, 18 years or older is another, and residency is a third. You'd think residency would be pretty clear by now. It's not. I'm not so worried about people being bussed in from out of state in the state of Colorado. I mean, there aren't a lot of people in western Kansas that abut our eastern part of the state, or Wyoming. I mean, we're sort of a lot of rural areas around us. But the problem we do have, and this is one of the huge problems with the new law that Colorado passed, is people don't have to be residents of the district they vote in. They don't have to be residents. They only have to intend to live in that district. So we actually had we had some very contentious recall elections. We had someone come down to Colorado Springs. He lived in Boulder. For those of you who don't know, Boulder, Colorado Springs, very different places. He came down to vote, and he executed a lease with a friend of his, and he was very publicly said, I don't live in Colorado Springs, but I intend to live in Colorado Springs, and I'm going to vote. And he voted. Now, he cast a blank ballot. He wasn't looking to influence and change the result of that election. He was looking to prove a point. So the folks on the left screamed bloody murder. In fact, it's the only time I've ever heard them want to prosecute anyone for vote fraud. But this was it. And so they demanded a prosecution. The DA pushed it up to the AG, so he didn't have any conflicts. And the AG ultimately said, we can't prosecute. We can't prove, and the law is ambiguous here. So that's a problem. And one of my concerns is sort of the issue of gypsy voters here in Colorado. Well, I shouldn't say here in Colorado. One of the ways we're working, and this is how technology I think can change that, hopefully, we're rolling out the very first statewide electronic poll book, real-time poll book in the country. So if you show up to vote in a polling, and we still have service centers, and with same-day voter registration, if you show up and vote on a day, and you get registered on that list, it will immediately propagate to every single poll book in the entire state of Colorado, no matter where it is. So that works actually very well if you're using the same name. Okay, if you're using a different name, not so much. And of course, the problem isn't necessarily voting twice, it's voting once, but maybe instead of your very safe seat, going to one that's a highly competitive seat. So you're only voting once. You're declaring that intent, and then voting. Hopefully, though, over time, technology will improve on this stuff now that we've built that statewide system. And like I say, it's the first in the country, and there's all kinds of headaches as far as security of the systems, getting every county on board with security and things like that. I can see a point in the future where that system contains photos as well. So we could have a photo ID state, and if someone doesn't have a photo with them, we can link up with the Department of Motor Vehicles and say, we have a photo online. Or we could take a photo as someone walks into the polling place if they don't have it there. Now, that person may still vote, but if it's ultimately found to be fraudulent, we now have a photo of that person to help chase down. So there's possibilities in the future there. Citizenship. So Colorado has been forward-leaning with respect to citizenship. We do have access to the SAVE database from the Department of Homeland Security, and we're one of the very first states in the country to do that. That data has problems too. I know you'll be surprised to hear me say that there is a federal government database with errors in it, and some of those things. For example, people may become a naturalized citizen because their parents were, but that doesn't necessarily show up in a governmental database. And likewise, that database is only good for legally present non-citizens who provide an A number, an alien number, that is correctly recorded by the Department of Motor Vehicles when they get a driver's license, if they choose to get a driver's license. So there's real limitations in our ability to do that. Nonetheless, we sent out letters, and we identified about 1,000 people who mostly voluntarily removed themselves. What I have found is you often see voter registration drives encouraging non-citizens to register to vote. That's frankly where most of it comes from. Colorado recently passed a law that provides driver's license to illegally present people, illegal aliens. And so we now issue driver's licenses to them. I didn't support the law, but it is actually helpful because now we're receiving information from Department of Motor Vehicles of people who have self-identified as not being here legally. Not just, and we're able to get that with some sense of security in the quality of that data. There's still errors in it, and frankly, there's a lot more things we could do. Colorado and the federal government doesn't give us access to juror recusal roles. In other words, people who have not yet become jurors, they recuse themselves because they're not citizens. We don't have access to that. We don't have access to other databases. If we're able to get that, and I hope one day in the future we will, that will help solve this issue, this problem of non-citizens. And I still emphasize, I think a lot of this stuff comes about because you have irresponsible voter registration drives. And the voter registration drives get paid by the number of people they register to vote. And if there's a prosecution, it is rarely against the voter registration drive. It's against the person who is now registered to vote or who illegally voted. And that doesn't, now there's some purposeful behavior by people who vote in that instance, but that's one of the issues. Again, working with databases, getting better at this stuff, I think is going to help over time, but you got to be able to get access to it. And a lot of this stuff we just don't have access to right now. With respect to disabled voting, I think Colorado does a pretty good job. One of the areas when it comes to election integrity, though, are frankly nursing homes. And tragic as it is, a lot of times the elderly, they have cognitive degradation as they get older, sometimes through disease or through old age. And I've heard plenty of instances where people will take advantage of that through undue influence, through a mail ballot or something along those lines. One of the things that we did to begin to solve that issue is sort of occupy the field. I actually worked with the Denver Clerk and Recorder. I paid for a whole bunch of iPads with printers. And so they go into nursing homes with bipartisan election judge teams to help disabled people in nursing homes, people vote. I feel comfortable because you do have a bipartisan team there, and they vote on that iPad, which is connected to a printer just a few feet away, so that actually prints off the ballot, and there are some secrecy protections in there so the ballot remains secret. But that reduces the ability for a partisan to come in and unduly influence someone who's gotten older. Let me just say a couple other things. I talked a little bit about registration. That's the data in. Registration lists were a big thing when they came about. We have same-day voter registration. So to some extent, for a pure voter same-day registration system, a voter registration list doesn't really mean anything. Great, you've got a list. Someone shows up and votes anyway, whether they're on that list or not. They suddenly become on the list. Nonetheless, it's important in Colorado because we have all mail, so that's based on our lists, our sloppy lists. Voter registration drives, I encourage them. I don't ever want to be someone who criticizes the concept, because that to me is a form of political speech that needs to be protected, that association. That said, some of them behave irresponsibly as far as what they're doing. So I think greater education of them and making sure that they follow the law better, I think is very important. The other thing that I would like to see ultimately, I sort of call it the one human being rule. I think it's a good thing that someone who's going to vote shows themselves as a human being once, okay? Once when they register or once when they vote, something along those lines. And if they can't present themselves, we can build a system, again using technology, where someone shows up. I gave you the nursing home example. That's not too huge of a problem. And I think that would be valuable. We have online voter registration in Colorado. We've been very aggressive on that. But it meets my one human being rule, because it is tied into our Department of Motor Vehicles, where someone has shown up and either gotten a driver's license or a state ID. So the one human being rule works. Let me lastly talk about enforcement. There is a real hesitancy to enforce things. And people, I think, who criticize, for example, photo ID and others, they say, well, there aren't any prosecutions. And unfortunately in elections, a lot of times people's common sense just gets thrown out the window. We don't measure our murder rate based on the number of successful prosecutions. We look at the number of dead bodies in the street, as it were. We don't look at any crime and measure it based on the number of successful prosecutions. We shouldn't do that with voting either. Now, the other thing with voting is that a lot of times it's very, very hard to even detect it. Let me give you two examples about sort of the, well, I've given you some examples about how difficult it can be to detect. Someone gets two ballots, two variants of their name, they sign both, they send it back. No one's ever going to know there's a problem. Same with these votes that occur, the confirmation card gets sent back, it bounces back just a few weeks later, no such person at that address or no address, an indicia, but there's no one to chase down. So they're very difficult to detect and identify. There's also a real hesitancy, and I'll provide two examples of that. With respect to citizens. So we did a big check, we sent out letters and things along those lines, and then we sent information to DAs for them to investigate. We had a few DAs who investigated. More frequently, we had DAs who either investigated and downplayed it or just refused to investigate. So one example is in one county we sent it to, they had about a half dozen. And one person had moved back to that foreign country, one, the statute of limitations had expired. For a variety of reasons, there were no prosecutions. And but it was pretty clear that there had been a violation of the law. I mean, when you think when there's no prosecution because the statute of limitations has expired, that doesn't mean people are innocent. It means you just can't get them, or you can't prove intent, or you can't contact the person who moved back to England in this particular instance, where they're likely a citizen. What happened is there was an announcement from that particular DA said, there's no problem here at all. Everything is just fine. To my viewpoint, there was a problem in that instance. We sent about 45 cases to another county, which was more interested in investigating me and my office to find out how I got that data. We provided them the memorandum of agreement with the Department of Homeland Security. Apparently they didn't like that, so they refused to even investigate anything. That was Denver, for those of you who may want to know. And then another example, for example, with a cross-check, we primarily use that with Kansas to identify people who may have voted in more than one state. We, first year I was in office, we found 7 people. I personally even looked at the signatures, and they were spot dead on, dead ringers, same signature, it was a very good match. We found 7 that there was just, in our view, no question. We sent it over to the FBI. The FBI did investigate. They knocked on each person's door. They said, don't do that again. And then they left. So there was no prosecution there either. So there's a real hesitancy, unfortunately. One of the DAs that did prosecute, one of the things he said was, geez, this takes so much time and effort. It took a massive amount of resources for him to investigate, and some he had to drop because he couldn't prove intent or something along those lines. So there's a real challenge. What that tells me is prevention is really the key. We can't rely on enforcement to solve these problems. We have to rely upon prevention, and that's really what's going to maintain the integrity of our election and our voter rolls. So I'm happy to answer questions afterwards. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Catherine Engelbrecht. I'm the founder of True the Vote. Thanks to Heritage for hosting this. Thank you, Hans, for inviting me. And thanks to the two gentlemen sitting to my left. It is not easy being a Secretary of State, and you guys do a great job, so thank you. True the Vote is an organization dedicated to preserving voters' rights and encouraging citizens to be involved. It started, frankly, as an outfall of my own personal experience in 2009 when I realized that there weren't nearly enough volunteers working inside of those polls. And Secretary Gessler just made an excellent point that it really comes down to, you can have all the technology in the world, you can have all the process in the world, but when you think about it, that's really the vehicle to protect your voice. It's the vehicle to protect your vote, to help your voice and your vote find its way where you want it to go. Without the citizens engaged, there is no opportunity for true prevention. There is no opportunity for true observation. And frankly, if citizens don't care enough to get involved, then oftentimes what you see is common sense kind of just slip away. And I feel like that's kind of where we are headed as a culture in many ways, but certainly as it relates to our voting process. So, what does True the Vote do specifically? We encourage citizens to participate inside of elections, and in order to help them get ready, we provide training to make sure that they know how to work inside the polls and kind of the general do's and don'ts. We provide opportunities for them to do research on the veracity of their own voter rolls. So through some of the technology that we've developed, you can go online and look at your local voter rolls, and if you see problems, you can report them to your county or appropriate election administrator. A citizen can't do anything past that, but they can report it. I think that in many respects we've sort of we've forgotten our civic responsibility in this particular area. I think many of us think that if we go in and we vote and we get the cool little "I voted" sticker and we wear it to work, that's it. We get the A+ for the day. That's not enough. Election Day should be a red letter day on all of our calendars, and we should all be out there and engaged to help facilitate, to help support, to help observe. This is a nonpartisan effort. Election integrity should unite us, not divide us. This should be something that the room should be overflowing as we all talk about how we are going to make sure that on November 4th we can have an honest and open debate that will lead our country in the way that truly reflects the will of the people. Against a portion of my better judgment, I'm going to do this. A quick show of hands. How many of you have actually worked inside the polls? Just quick raise your hands. Okay, keep them up, keep them up. If you are sitting next to someone that does not have their hands raised, I need just to ball up your fist and punch them in the shoulder. We need people out. When I first started with True the Vote, I was trying to get a handle on really how bad the problem was, because as a business owner, I can tell you that my experience inside the polls, certainly there were problems with integrity that we saw without question, but there were also just process-related problems. There were not enough hands to do what needed to be done. And I began to wonder, was that the case everywhere? And I stumbled across a report that had been put out by the Pew Foundation back in 2008. And I don't remember the exact title, but to paraphrase it, the title went something like, "What would happen if we had an election and everyone showed up?" And the answer essentially was the system would implode, because we're not set up to really facilitate all Americans engaging. That's something that we've got to turn. We've got to turn the tide on that, because America has a declining rate of voter participation, declining rate of voter turnout, and in fact we rank last in industrialized countries in the world for voter turnout, which, side note, we're also one of the few industrialized countries in the world without voter ID, but let me move on. there are many things that we are going to be doing in 2014 that we'd love you to be a part of. We are certainly offering right now online training for election workers. True the Vote cannot place you if you're an election worker, but when I say place, I mean we're not the ones that are going to tell you where to go work, but we'll help create that awareness about what you should be ready for and how to get engaged, which in most states, in some states you can be a citizen witness and go in and just kind of assign yourself. But in most states, what you have to do is find a party or a candidate that you want to go and work on behalf of. And now is that sort of golden period where counties and parties and candidates are desperately looking for people to go and represent their interests. So now's the time to get engaged. We have developed an app, a phone app that's going to be released probably in the next week or so, both for Android and for Apple, called Vote Stand. So you can go check this out. It is an online mechanism for you to be able to report anything that you see that is troubling to you, either certainly outside the polls or in the whole of the election process. There are things that occur during voter registration drives. There are things that occur in the facilitation of absentee balloting that we hear from citizens across the country constantly about. Constantly, I saw this, I saw that. Well, you've got to have proof. And these things happen in the blink of an eye. So what we're committed to is either dispelling the myth or proving up the facts. And one of the ways to do that is by being able to capture what you see, report it, and send it in. So check out Vote Stand, because it's certainly going to be in full swing for the 2014s. And then the last thing that we do, as it relates to some of the things we've talked about here today, is a program we have called Need ID. Need ID started in Texas, but we are going to be expanding it here in the next year. Need ID basically is an open call to anybody who is in a state that requires photo voter identification and have had difficulty getting it. That's something that we want to help them explore. Why can't they find identification, and what's the resolution there? Every eligible American citizen should have an opportunity to participate in an election that is free and fair without question. Voter ID, in my opinion, is certainly a mechanism to support the whole of our country. I think that certainly the majority of Americans agree with that, and I think we'd be much better served trying to help those folks who find themselves living in a culture that is ID dependent, and somehow they don't have one. This is a great program to be involved in. If you don't have photo ID, let us know, because we'd love to help you get it. So we are absolutely on all fronts on this with our organization. You can find out more at truethevote.org. But I guess my parting shot here is we all have to get involved. These are all things that we can talk about academically and mull over the pros and the cons of the process. But at the end of the day, if we don't protect our vote, we lose it. History shows that time and time again. This is not a game. This is not a drill. This is real life. This is how we decide the direction of our country. Please get involved. We'd love you to be involved with True the Vote. But if not, just get involved wherever your passion leads you, because believe me, there's going to be a need there to meet you where you're at. Thanks very much.
All right, I did fail on my one duty. I did want to tell you all about this before we go into questions. And this is a new booklet that the Heritage Foundation has put out on the basic issues we're talking about today. It raises some of the problems we have in our what is basically an honor system of registration and voting, and it gives recommended solutions to that, and then talks about some of the examples of problems we've had and voter fraud cases that have actually changed the outcomes of some elections and otherwise diluted people's votes. So I encourage everyone to take a look. I want to take the moderator's prerogative and ask the first question, and then we'll go to the audience. And that is, Chris, is probably mostly for you, but also Scott. You've got a little more than half the states participating in this interstate cross-check program, which to me is a great program because it allows secretaries of state to find out how many of their folks are registered illegally, potentially, in other states. What I don't understand, what are the excuses given by those states who aren't participating? Do they not want to know about the inaccuracies of their lists? Is it just bureaucratic red tape? I mean, it kind of in general, why isn't every single state participating in this?
Well, some of them have perfectly legitimate excuses like Alabama, that has a statutory barrier. You'll see that the states on either side of Alabama are in. They can't share voter data unless the legislature makes it. They have a blanket prohibition on a sharing of data held by the state, but they just need a statutory fix, and they've already got that proposed, and I think that'll happen eventually. There is one state that I think probably has no excuse. Minnesota used to be in, and then they decided to get out without any explanation that I'm aware of. Texas, for example, would be a great state to have in, but there secretaries of state are appointed officials, not elected. They're relatively short tenure, and so it's hard to get someone who's actually in office, understands what they need to do, and then get it done. There's also been some, and Catherine can maybe speak to this, there's also been some reluctance on their part to do it unless they're told by the legislature, which frankly I don't understand, because if they have the statutory authority to do it as Secretary of State, why wouldn't they? Since the Secretary of State's job is in part to keep the voter rolls clean. It kind of, and then in a couple of other states, like, some of these states have, they don't have a Secretary of State. Not every state has a Secretary of State. Some of them have a board, and it's very difficult to get the board to make a decision or to even contact the board to figure out who has the authority to make a decision to join the program. So I am continuing to push the number. I think we will pass 30 fairly soon, but I doubt that we will ever get to all 50. I'm not holding my breath on California.
Yeah, let me. My frustration is if you look at that map, 3 of those states border Colorado, and then you've got Texas and California, of which half the people in those states want to live in Colorado. So there's a fair amount of migration there. One of the things that I have found is when you look at a lot of government officials, and I always have to be self-observant and self-aware in this. Government officials, they're human beings, and we all want to do the right thing. And a lot of people are very dedicated to their jobs, but I see this certainly on the county level and sometimes on the state level. And they're responsible for the systems, and they build the systems, and they do that. And when people come and criticize their systems or say this can be done better, sometimes there's a natural human reaction to say, well, that system is me. I built that system. And when you criticize that system, you're criticizing me, and I don't want to hear that criticism. That's exacerbated sometimes in the voting context because local officials and state officials who are elected get lots of criticism, trust me. Some of it warranted, some of it unwarranted, a lot of it unwarranted. And so sometimes they go into this defensive hunker and they say, "Yet, they're just not interested in new ideas." And you always have to sometimes struggle against that, or at least present those new ideas in a way that aren't threatening to some officials who feel threatened by that.
All right, we're going to go to the audience, and if you would, wait for the microphone to come so that people watching this over the internet and the web can hear your question. And if you would, just please identify yourself, and please ask a question rather than making a statement. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, my name is Leah Schwarting from Talk Radio News Service. And I was wondering, you talked a lot about getting people educated about the polls and the vote, but a lot of surveys actually show that some people don't even know what voter ID laws are. So what would you say about getting people educated about that?
Chris, since you have.
Sure. We when we passed our law, and there was a lot of legislative concern to make sure everybody knew that these changes had taken place and that they needed a photo ID. And by the way, of course, we provide a free one for anyone who doesn't have one. We provide a free replacement birth certificate if they're born in Kansas and need one for the purpose of registering. But we face that issue. We want to inform the electorate as quickly as possible. So we did sort of an all-out blitz, including radio ads, including as much internet outreach as we could. And so we have a website, gotvoterid.com. And I guess we were the first ones to get it. Someone will get .org, I'm sure, before too long. But we did basically this outreach based on the old Got Milk commercials. And I think it was pretty successful given the really low percentage of people that showed up at the polls without their photo ID. And it's amazing how quick, I'll just add this one other point, it's amazing how quickly the electorate accepted this new aspect of our voting system. Like in the primary election of 2012, that was the first big election we had By the general election in November of 2012, it was old news. It was, everybody was just kind of, yeah, this is what we do now. There was very little newspaper interest in the law. I was like, okay, we've done that, we're moving on. And so I don't know that necessarily means that our efforts to inform voters were successful. I believe they were, but it does mean that the electorate has sort of adapted to it very quickly. And most people, I talked to many people, I shouldn't say most, but many people were surprised we weren't doing it already. You hear all these stories, and I'm sure Scott's heard them too, of people who show up at the polls before you have a photo ID law in place, and they want to show a photo ID, and they're told, no, you can't. I think, didn't James O'Keefe try to do that with the voting for Eric Holder? The point is that it's not particularly surprising to people. We live in a photo ID society where you have to have a photo ID to do so many things, and so this one is not a real hard one for people to adapt to.
And I would just add, so along the lines of human nature, you have to make sure that the information is available at the time people want it. Just before an election, that's when people are going to want it. I would guess, right, even now, if you were to do a survey, half the people in the country would think that photo ID is required at the polls. A huge percentage think that it's required. But if you've got those information systems in place where at the time of the election people can look it up very quickly, and it's perishable, people forget. I'll admit, for Colorado's IDs, I looked it up last night again, and there were things that I had forgotten because you just forget this stuff, and then when you need it, you've got to be able to get access to that information or have it readily available and an easy process for people to be able to get those IDs.
Aaron?
Yes, I'm Erin Anderson.
Hang on a second.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Erin Anderson, and I've worked as an election officer. I'm curious about the correlation between those states who do this voter ID and this database where you compare, and those states that have a secure driver's license. Because I notice on your chart, Delaware isn't participating, yet Delaware was very good about cleaning up their driver's license rolls. And so can you offer up any comment on that?
I can at least talk a little bit because our state's involved in both of those, this as well as Eric, and I've been an enthusiastic participant. I don't know of any correlation at all. I think a lot of times it depends on sort of local vagaries, who the Secretary of State is, how active they want to be, whether or not they happen to have the capability to use that data versus who runs the DMV. There's three, or the driver's licenses, we call it DMV. There's three states. You've got, Maine, Michigan, and Illinois, where the Secretary of State runs both systems. But beyond that, politically and administratively, there's not necessarily a correlation.
Yeah, I'd agree. There's not a whole lot of correlation. Getting a state to change the way they administer their driver's licenses often requires legislative action. In every case, driver's licenses are a really huge administrative task, whereas a state joining the Interstate Crosscheck project is very easily done. So, there are barriers to changing driver's licenses that don't exist for joining this.
Shouldn't there be a correlation?
I think so. If you have the same concern about security of identity, yeah, you would think that a state that's concerned about one would be in both projects. So there should be, but I think in practice, oftentimes it's just the administrative realities mean that there isn't.
Get somebody in the back, the lady right back there.
Hi, I'm Pam Fessler with NPR News. Secretary Kobach, if you don't get an EAC decision prior to the election, do you have an estimate of how many voters you're going to have registered in the state on this, dual system that will just be federally registered? And then sort of what kind of challenges is that going to present to election officials in trying to administer the election?
Well, in the primary, which was on August 5th, the way we're assuming that we won't have a decision just because we have to be prepared for that eventuality. So in the primary on August 5th, we had fewer than 200 total voters in the state who had registered using the federal form and had not provided photo ID. We then, using that number, we then created a sort of federal elections only voter roll, if you will, sort of a roll in addition to the main voter roll. And it didn't include all of the 105 counties. It included, a minority of the counties. And then those people, when they showed up, they were to be given a provisional ballot and told that they would be, they actually would occur on the back end. Even if the poll worker didn't know that that's why they were being given a provisional ballot, the county canvass would count only the federal elections on the ballot. We have a similar process in Kansas if you show up at the wrong polling place. you show up on one side of town, you actually live on the other. You can still vote on the other side of town, but the state rep district, the city council district will be different, and so you will only count, the ballot will only be counted for the races that you are actually, that you're eligible to vote in on that other side of town. Anyway, to answer your question, we're going to be doing a final count. Our registration period actually closes today. Today's the last day to register in Kansas. As soon as it closes, we'll have a final count. My guess is it probably will be in the range of, maybe 300 or 400. We'll know soon what that number is for the whole state. And by the way, of those fewer than 200 people, it was, if my memory serves, like 186 or something like that. Only one actually showed up to vote out of that entire number. So we'll see what the number is. But so the numbers are pretty small and pretty manageable right now. And we're hopeful that we'll get a decision that'll be a favorable one, and then we won't have to maintain a separate federal elections only list.
All right. Unfortunately, we've gotten to the end of our session. I would like to thank our Secretaries of State, who are a little bit busy right now with an election coming up. Catherine also for coming. Thanks a lot. We appreciate it.